Lord Almighty God, touch my lips of clay that my words may not just be mine, but they all may be inspired by your Holy Spirit. It's been a difficult few weeks, and although I've been on vacation, I haven't been in a vacuum, and I've been very careful to keep my mouth shut, because my instincts are not always exactly what they would be 2 days down the road. You speak of regret, and you just end up adding to the pot, just throwing your own little flaming brand into the conflagration, and it doesn't help. You need time and consideration, and you need to tend to your own soul. First and foremost, our community, our nation, is made up of individuals, and if we tend to our own souls, we will have a powerful effect on that whole. That being said, I looked at our scripture today, and at the same time I was reading Twelfth Night, the play by Shakespeare. And I'm going to try and integrate some of the lessons which are ancient with some of the things which are new. And I might not succeed, and I'm not guaranteeing that I will have anything better to say than other people who may have already said better on these subjects. In Twelfth Night, Portia is addressing Shylock. And Shylock is a stereotype. Shylock is the Jew, he is the moneylender, he is the miser. And Shylock is insisting upon justice. He is insisting upon his rights. He is insisting upon the price to be paid for the loan that he made, which was then dishonored. And the price was a pound of flesh. He had enacted a contract with both parties which said, if I cannot pay you back, I will give you a pound of my flesh. And after he was unable to pay it back, Shylock is pressing for his rights. Portia addresses Shylock and says, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. It is mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute of awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above his sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute of God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest gods when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. Justice is an overused and underthought word. We use it all the damn time to mean a whole range of different things. But we use it to mean whatever suits us at any particular time. Justice, as we read it in the Bible, is generally quite a nuanced thing. It's a delicate thing. It means multiple things. In the Old Testament, we can see it as loving kindness. It's not just getting one's rights. It's not just about being right and then enforcing the legacy of that rightness. Justice sometimes means fidelity to the law, whether or not that law is just. Sometimes it is a tit-for-tat, knee-jerk sort of vengeance. MCC means and meant very well when it talks of social justice, but it's often cheap. It's often a very easy thing to say. It is often sloganizing. It is often a banner that we crouch under and that we crouch behind. And we don't really think through what is meant by that. Frequently, we see it as replacing the oppressors with us, so that their oppressive decisions that have afflicted us will be replaced by our oppressive decisions, which will afflict a different group, a group that we hate. And the cycle then is perpetuated. And this cycle has been rolling on century by century, from time immemorial, with different groups finding an ascendancy and then becoming the Puritans and the oppressors. And I think we're called to see justice as something more than codified revenge, than finding a seat at the table and getting to choose who can eat. The Jew, Shylock, in Twelfth Night, is the type, the archetype of an aggrieved class. Shakespeare would not have known any Jews, nor would anybody in his audience. They would not have read this, or rather listened to this, and gone out looking for the Jews, because there weren't any in England at that time. They had all been expelled by King Edward I in the 13th century after being completely soaked for all their possessions by an office of the king known as the Exchequer of the Jews, who was specifically in place to suck every last nickel of this community. And when finally every last nickel had been sucked from them, they were put on ships and expelled from England. And the ship's captains had been paid a certain amount to get them out of the country, and they were frequently left, whole communities, on sandbars in the Thames and the North Sea where they drowned. So there were no Jews in England when Shakespeare wrote this. But he knew of the archetype, and to people of Shakespeare's time, the Jew was an archetype of several things. Religious uncleanness, the Christ killers, the blood libel, which came back in the early 20th century and in the 19th century in Germany, and then again in Russia, and that provoked the great pogroms. The blood libel, this belief that Jews sacrificed Christian children to incorporate their blood in the bread of Passover. The blood libel was an English invention in the 12th century. So it wasn't until a century after Shakespeare that Jews came back to Britain. It was called the resettlement of Jews, and Puritans opposed it, because Puritans do that sort of thing. The Puritans opposed it. To men and women of Shakespeare's day, Jews were primarily an archetype of religious unhygiene and the obsession with mammon and the money-grasping role. Shylock is not an attempt to overturn that stereotype. Shakespeare was not some modern-day arch-progressive who was determined to cudgel us all into believing something other than what they believed. Shakespeare was a subverter, not an overturner. When he was first depicted, Shylock was a comic book villain. The first references to actors that we have taking the part of Shylock show that he was made up to look like the Wicked Witch of the West and hunchbacked and all the rest of it. He was a knockabout villain. And then a century later, he was a terrifying villain. But by the 19th century, he had become sympathetic. And now, if you get a portrayal of Shylock, he's portrayed as an almost godlike voice of justice, representing the whole tragic history of Jewry. And both extremes do an injustice. Shylock does not have to be de-Jewed or super-Jewed in order to find overlapping experience and identity with the other characters in the play. To put it in modern language, intersectionality. That's the word of the day, thank God. The fact that we can actually have overlapping experience with people who may appear very different to us, and that their particular labels do not mean that they are immune from sharing the majority of human experience with our particular label. So, Shylock's hardest accusation in the play, whilst demanding the collateral on the loan, which was the pound of flesh, is that he and his accusers are one and the same. That he is a stereotype precisely in order to take those unattractive qualities and pour them onto an exterior individual. And Shylock is effectively acting as a mirror to his accusers and says, all I am, you are too. And then he says, the famous line about, "If you prick me, do I not bleed?" Showing his common humanity. But he's not saying that in a nice way to say, "Oh, I'm just like you folks." He's saying, "Oh no, you're just like me." And there's a difference. We are worried and we parcel up our wickedness and deposit on external groups for a very good reason. It's to avoid looking at it. It's to avoid having it in the house. It's like being given some ghastly present at Christmas by a much-loved relative. You try and give it away as quickly as possible. You don't want to see the damn thing. The mean, money-grubbing, miserly Jew takes the fall for characteristics that are and were universal. Now, where does this come in? It comes in because to the people of first century Palestine, the Canaanites would have been a very, very close corollary to the 16th century concept of the Jew. They were polluters of the true faith, who outraged the covenant with God with their irregular worship and their unclean practices. See the parallel? Jesus, especially Matthew's Jesus, because Matthew was writing, we are very sure, for a Jewish Christian audience, and was a Jewish Christian himself, and of course all the early Christians, bar a couple, were Jewish Christians, openly declared that he had a targeted ministry. And we ought to be comfortable with that, because we are a targeted ministry. There are lots of targeted ministry. If you've ever been to a port and seen the mission to seafarers, that's a targeted ministry. You know, the Salvation Army was originally a targeted ministry. Any missionary that went off to India or wherever started out as a targeted ministry. St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent by the Pope to re-evangelize those wicked Britons. That was a targeted ministry. There's no shame or horror in that. Jesus claims, "I have a targeted ministry. I am sent first and foremost to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And the Canaanite woman, the polluted woman, the corollary would be the Jewess with our Shakespearean analogy. The polluted woman says certain things which show her common humanity, her intersectionality with the experience of Jesus and with the reality of Jesus' humanity. She tells him about the possession of her daughter, the illness of her daughter, the madness of her daughter, however you want to see it. And she begs him for some of that grace which she knows he has been dispensing across the Holy Land. And the disciples have told her to bugger off several times. She's been a plague, she's been a nuisance. They don't want nothing to do with her. She is undesirable. And she's claiming to have some sort of hold on this Jesus. And she really has none. She has none. But from a place of humility, she is desperate for some of what Jesus has. And she persuades him in this. He says to her, "It is not fair to take the food of the children and give it to the dogs." Now at this point, most of us, without tenderness, would have walked out in horror. How dare you speak to me like that? We also would have walked away from Jesus in horror. Our pridefulness, our need for our rights, would have forced us to walk away from the source of grace which could transform us. And probably with most of us, might have overcome our love for our daughter, for the one who was in such grave condition that we were begging at the feet of this Jesus guy who was from another religious tradition, who looked at us like vermin. That's what we would have thought. I mean, what would the equivalents have been? It would have been going to some Baptist minister in the deep south and asking for a miracle, knowing that he looked at us like God only knows what. Well, she did it because of love, faith and love. The love she had for her daughter overcame her pridefulness, and the faith she had that Jesus could do what she was asking overcame the fact that she was shamed and disgusted maybe at the fact that she was doing what she was doing. But the common humanity brought the healing, brought the miracle. Well, the Canaanite woman melts Jesus' heart and brings her miracle. It is her humble request for his humanity, even in the face of incorrect language, that brings a meeting of the Messiah and the polluted desecrator of the Jewish faith. And the fact that we might look back and think, well, she wasn't really, doesn't mean that she wasn't seen like that, and that the Jewish people whom Jesus was serving didn't look at her like that, and would have viewed his dispensation to her as something gravely wicked. And of course, this whole patch of the gospel starts off with Jesus outraging the sensibilities of the Pharisees by claiming that it's not really what goes into your mouth that pollutes you, it's what comes out your mouth. Which to the Pharisees seems to be a very pointed criticism of the Jewish hygiene laws and the Jewish moral hygiene laws. So it's this faith that brings about that meeting. And she says, in other words, to Jesus, in words that we would recognize from elsewhere, she says, "Am I not a man and brother? Or to return to Shakespeare, if you prick me, do I not bleed?" So, to bring in another character from our common history, Martin Luther King is the very type of gracious justice. And at the risk of co-opting him, something which I think he would have very much appreciated, because it meant that people were buying into his message and accepting what he had to teach, his prophetic words, he would have intimately understood the mutual recognition of common humanity that happened between Jesus and the Canaanite woman, and which happened imperfectly in America in the 1960s, and that happened in the West in the 1990s and 2000s with straight people and gay men and women, and which is happening now in fits and starts between trans people and those whose birth gender matches their gender identity. It is the grand narrative of the liberal project, the bringing together of alienation and the nurturing of understanding, the reaching across the aisle and the grasping of the hand. It is very different to the squabbling over labels and language and the circular firing squad that bedevils parts of our movement today. Overlapping concepts of class, wealth, culture, geography, race, and gender, as well as overlapping experiences of oppression and poverty, indignity and brutalization, of internal despair and misery, bizarrely offer us hope. We can communally make our mess our message, not seek to build exclusive empires of disunity and oppression. It is our common brokenness that brings us hope. It is an often overlooked fact that Puritanism was a disease of what we now call the left. It wasn't just prudishness, which is what we often think of it as. It was a revolutionary temptation. Puritans did not want to just correct the behavior of others. Puritans wanted to tear down the structures of the society in which they lived. Puritans wanted to unseat the king and unseat the bishops. Puritans wanted to ban everything that kept people human. Puritans banned the theatre, they banned Christmas, they banned dancing, they banned music, they banned hymns and celebrations in churches, they banned Easter, for goodness sakes. Puritans tore down the structures which were the historic inheritance of the people who were living at the time, and replaced it with their purified or corrected version of reality. And Puritanism comes at us from the far right and the far left, and often squeezes us in the middle as human beings. Puritanism is what is taught in fundamentalist mosques in Saudi Arabia. Puritanism is what scourged my own country and tore away all the interiors of the churches and the cathedrals. Puritanism is what was such a mixed inheritance for this country. Puritanism is also what is taught at times in the Students' Union of University of California, Berkeley. There are lots of different forms of Puritanism, and we need to fight for them. Fight because they will seek to sweep us all away. and to replace us with something inhuman and something with which we cannot share any common experience. They will seek to impress labels upon us so deeply that only when we have been adequately labelled and put into our pigeonholes will we be allowed to exist. And we must follow this. The trouble is that Puritanism has no room for grace. Sometimes justice has no room for grace. As Portia said in the 12th night to Shiloh, if we have but justice, then we have no salvation. We desperately need to seek for grace, to attend to our own souls, to be able to model the sort of things we want to see elsewhere before just standing up and shouting them. We need to be able to be the sort of person we treasure, and that's a lifelong business. And if we can't, then at least we have to be gracious to the failings of others. We have to reach in and learn how to speak the language of our enemies so that we can speak to our enemies in a language they understand. And if they won't do it to us, fine, but at least we have to do it if we seek to be better than those we oppose. And fundamentally, we have to fight hatred, not just in those that we hate. Think about that. We say we hate hatred. We are fighting against hatred. We stand against hatred. What that often means is that we just hate a different group of people and we believe our reasons are better than their reasons. Which means that we are forever sundered from the people who are doing the oppressing and the hating in our eyes. And we can never, ever, ever, ever influence them to the good. We have to be able to reach across. And therefore, we have to be able to see a humanity in what appears to be inhuman. We have to be able to not only pray for the dead of Charlotte and the dead of Barcelona, but we have to especially see the truth of the matter. The perpetrators are in the most inhumanly, inconceivably appalling state to have been able to do such a thing. You can only imagine the depths of wickedness, the depths of despairing hatred that brings somebody to do something like that. And therefore, just as we pray for those who are brutalized by it, we must pray for the perpetrators and the future perpetrators. Yeah. We have to. Just like we have to pray for our political opponents, and we don't have to pray for them to be, all, what's the word I'm looking for, all conquering, but we do have to pray for them in a very human way. I don't have any magic words for our current situation. I really don't. If it was left up to me, I might have said nothing, and I would have regretted it. But what I do have are my grandmother's words, which were effective to me, and built up a filter within me, whereby every time I found myself wanting to say something when I was a child, like, I hate my teacher, or I hate such and such, my grandmother would look at me and she would say, very carefully, she'd say, what do you mean when you say you hate them? And then instead of being able to get away with that burst of hatred and feeling superior, I'd have to unpack the damn thing to my grandmother. Which meant that I had to actually look at what the other person might be thinking and wanting and fearing and terrified of. And then I had to look at why I hated them, what it was sparking. She was like a blasted psychoanalyst. 80-year-old Yorkshire psychoanalyst taking me through this, except that it was an almost saintly compassion that had built up within her over her 80 years, which had caused her to do it. A filter, an impenetrable filter, which meant that every time she found herself wanting to go there, because it would make her temporarily feel good, the filter came down and she said, okay, so what are they thinking? What are they doing? Why are they doing New Testament. And even in a life which was marked with a great deal of poverty and struggle and tragedy, she was brought up in desperate poverty in the Northern Mills. She found she was able to find grace. And therefore, in the midst of our turmoil and trouble and frustration, where we sometimes feel we're just in a situation of a family argument, where you've given up reasoning and you're just bawling at one another, you know? Well, maybe you don't know. Maybe I'm giving something away about my childhood. But we've got to do better than this somehow. We've got to do better than this. God knows, I daren't look at Twitter anymore. Social media is closed to me. But we must do better. And I must do better. I really must. And I pray that you help me to do better. And that we can find some compassion and grace as a community instead of just shouting.